1 Samuel chapter 13. 1 Samuel chapter 13. We've been tracking the somewhat meteoric rise of Saul from the unknown son of a Benjamite to the first king of the united 12 tribes of Israel. Thus far, in these chapters that we've been getting to know him, he has shown humility, deference, military prowess. In chapter 11, Saul led the armies of Israel against Nahash the Ammonite to deliver the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead. You remember this? And he did great. Even in victory, when he won, Saul showed mercy and he forwarded the glory for the victory on to God. Thus far, we have no strikes against Saul. He's doing great. If the story ended here, we'd say Saul was a good king. But you know the story doesn't end here. In 1 Samuel 12, Samuel addresses the people in Gilgal. And he follows, this is following their win over the Ammonites. He calls everybody to Gilgal and they're going to talk. And he's going to kind of give them a little bit of a history lesson. Going to remind them of some things. He reminded them of their long history and of God's faithfulness. He talked about God bringing them out of Egypt and all the good things that he'd done for them. He reminded them that their demand for a king wasn't right. He said, look, what you did, you sinned against God. But he told them that he would continue to pray for them. And it ended on a good note, sort of. Look at verse 24 of chapter 12, since it's real close. He says, only fear the Lord. Serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things he's done for you. But if ye shall do wickedly, ye shall be consumed, both ye and your king. So it's good, but it kind of has a barb there on the end of it. He says, look, if you do right, then good things will happen, but you do wickedly and you'll be consumed, you and your king. And again, all of this was being said by Samuel, and Saul would have been standing right next to it. It says, you'll be consumed, you and your king. Now, you wouldn't think so, but Saul has already peaked. The victory of 1 Samuel 11 could be called the high water mark of Saul's time as king. We've already plateaued. It doesn't get any better than it's already been. We'll start going downhill tonight. But there's some background that we should get into before we cover that. There's some trouble brewing. First off, in verse 1. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, so it's the events of the prior 2 chapters took approximately 1 year, and the events we read of in chapter 13 likely took place in what would have been Saul's 2nd year of his reign. Verse 2, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. This has also been called Gibeah of Saul in another passage. So the same town, Gibeah of Benjamin, Gibeah of Saul, because Saul is a Benjamite. And the rest of the people, he sent every man to his tent. So Saul has a standing army of 3,000 men. 2,000 with him, 1,000 with his son Jonathan. Now this standing army had been prophesied. If you remember back to chapter 8, it was prophesied that if you get a king, if you have a centralized monarchy, he's going to have a standing army. It wasn't condemned, but it was prophesied. Again, Saul has divided his forces, and I'll put a map up here for you. We're right here. If you see where the inset is, the inset is kind of a zoom in that they've pulled out. If you look in the inset, you'll see Michmash, you'll see Bethel, and you'll see Gibeah. Okay, so they're all right there in a fairly small area. We're talking 20 miles that we're dealing with all total here this evening. They're here, and Saul has 2,000 men with him in Michmash and Mount Bethel. So they're close enough together that his army kind of expands across these. Jonathan has 1,000 in Gibeah of Benjamin. Verse 3. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines. So real quick, just by way of mentioning this and getting it in your heads, we think of Saul as a young man But Saul has a son, his firstborn son at least, who is old enough to lead armies in combat. So Saul would be, how old do you think? We don't know exactly, but what would you guess? How old would you think a man would have to be to have a child who could lead men in combat?
40 or 45.
At least 45.
45 is what commentators would agree to as well. Some people say 30, which I'd say, whew, either his son is really little or Saul started having children very early. So 45 is probably on the low end. He could have been 50, perhaps. We don't know exactly, but he's not a young man. Now, I'm not trying to be insulting to anybody who is 40 or 45. When I say he's not a young man, I mean he's not 25. He's not a young king. He's a man who has reached full age, and he has a son who has also reached full age. Verse 3, and Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba. We've already talked about this a little bit earlier in another passage, this garrison. And the Philistines heard of it. Well, of course they would. A garrison is an outpost. And Jonathan goes and he picks a fight with one of the Philistine outposts. Now it's interesting because Geba would be in this same general area. If you see Michmash right there, do you see it in the inset? Just below that is Geba, so it's not far. It's actually, where is Jonathan from verse 2? He's in Gibeah. Where is Saul? Michmash. So who's closer? Saul would be closer. But Jonathan took the initiative, went a little bit further, and attacked the Philistine outpost in Geba. Verse 4. We'll finish in verse 3. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land. So the Philistines hear of it. So somebody has got the nest of hornets stirred up. The Philistines are upset. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten a garrison of the Philistines. You say, wait a minute, it was Jonathan. Well, he was working for Saul. So I don't think they're being unfair here. Our forces have attacked their forces. So there's strife here. Saul had smitten a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also was had in abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. When the Bible says that Israel was also had in abomination, it means that they were made odious or made loathsome. They had been dwelling together. There was an adversarial relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites. But now it's gone from just calling names to actual bloodshed. Jonathan has taken his 1,000 men and has attacked the Philistine garrison, and the outpost has been sacked. And so it's not just bad blood. It's gone beyond talking, and now it's gone to armed conflict. Anticipating trouble, Saul calls all of Israel to join him in Gilgal. Now, Saul is in Michmash, and I don't have the map up here right this second. But why Gilgal? Why Gilgal? I told you, whenever you hear Gilgal, you need to take note, because most of the big events in the life of King Saul will happen in or around Gilgal. Well, Gilgal was the central meeting place where Samuel had told Saul to come. You remember when he told him? Well, back in chapter 10, verse 8, we read, this is Samuel talking to Saul. And he says, and thou shalt go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down unto thee to offer burnt offerings, and to sacrifice sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days shalt thou tarry till I come to thee, and show thee what thou shalt do. Saul is a military leader. He's a political leader. He's not a spiritual leader. He's not called to be the spiritual leader. In this day, there was very defined offices between the priest and the king. Interestingly, both were anointed positions. Priests were anointed into their role. The king had been anointed into his. But the roles were not to be interchangeable. Saul is to lead armies. Saul is to be the political head of the nation of Israel. but he's not to be the spiritual leader. When it comes to sacrifices and offerings being made, Saul was supposed to go to Gilgal, and he was supposed to wait. What was he supposed to do in Gilgal? Wait. Who's he waiting for? Samuel. And he's waiting for Samuel because he's not supposed to offer sacrifices. In response to Jonathan's raid and Saul's proclamation, verse 5, the Philistines obviously are aware of what's going on. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash, eastward from Beth-aven. Okay, real quick. How many in the standing army of Israel? 3,000, divided into two groups, 1,000 and 2,000. How many Philistines are we talking? Well, we've got an awful lot, right? We've got 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, which some would say that those go together, that you've got 2 horsemen per chariot. It could be that, or it could be the chariots, and then you have the horse-bound cavalry, and then you have the infantry, which is more in number than the sands of the sea. Now, Saul had been in Michmash. That's where they come. Where is Saul now? He's in Gilgal. What's he doing in Gilgal? Waiting. What's he waiting for? He's waiting for Samuel to come. But the Philistines perhaps don't realize that he's gone from Michmash to Gilgal. So they convene in Michmash. And they're all gathered together and they're getting ready to go. Saul's army is only 15 or 20 miles away from a vastly outnumbering Philistine force. We'll see in a few verses that numbers weren't their only disadvantage. That the numbers were the least of their worries. Let's talk about Israelite morale here. Morale is important among soldiers in battle. Napoleon Bonaparte, who knew a little bit about soldiers, said, "An army's effectiveness depends on its size, training, experience, and morale. And morale is worth more than any of the other factors combined." Morale is very important. What is morale? Can do. It's their attitude, right? When everything's against you and all the soldiers are sitting around their campfires drawing with sticks on the ground saying, "We're all going to die, boys." Is that good morale? How's that going to go when you say, "Okay, upward and onward, men"? They say, "We're all going to die," right? They're not into it. And morale is monumentally low. We actually have it recorded for us. Verse 6. When the men of Israel saw they were in a strait means they're in a tough spot. They're between a rock and a hard place. When they saw they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, again, they are aware of their situation. Then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. Saul's army is being destroyed by desertion. In the central highlands of Israel, there were an awful lot of caves and places to hide. This is what it looks like in that general area. Lots of hills, lots of valleys, lots of little crooks that you could go and you could hide out in. There are towns scattered throughout there as well. And Saul's army of 3,000 is literally melting into the hills. He's going to lose a large portion of his army. Verse 7, those who didn't escape into the hills, and some of the Hebrews went over Jordan. They really got out of Dodge. They went across the Jordan entirely, headed to the east. It says they went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Bad morale, bad attitude, bad spirit amongst the troops. They're all sitting there, and when it says that they're trembling, it means to quake, to terrify, to shudder. They're sitting there and they're shaking. The few of them who are left, and those, many of them have just gone off into the hills. And those who haven't gone into the hills have run all the way across Jordan. They say, this isn't a fight we can win. This isn't a fight we want. We're just getting out of here. And Saul makes his blunder. Take a look at verse 8. And he, Saul, tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed him. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So he's sitting here. He's supposed to do what in Gilgal? Wait. He's waiting for Samuel. He's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. And as he's waiting, he's bleeding people. He's bleeding his army. His army is hemorrhaging away from him. Again, Samuel set the time in 1 Samuel 10, verse 8, which we've already read. He says, "Go down, 7 days shalt thou tarry till I come to thee and show thee what thou shalt do." You wait 7 days, I'm going to come, I'm going to offer sacrifices. And Saul is doing just that, and as he waits, his army continually dwindles and escapes into the hills and across the Jordan. So Saul, in a moment of desperation, says in verse 9, and Saul said, "Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. A direct defiance, direct disobedience of the command that Samuel had given him. And thus, because Samuel was the voice of God, he had disobeyed the direct command of God. God said, "You go to Gilgal, you wait. You wait for Samuel. When Samuel gets there, he'll offer sacrifices." And Saul, because he's sitting there and he's waiting and Samuel doesn't come at the appointed time, he decides, you know what, enough of this. I'm just going to do it myself. And he directly disobeys the express orders of God. He sacrifices himself. Verse 10. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. Saul went out to meet him that he might salute him. What a coincidence, right? You think it's a coincidence? What are the odds that Samuel would show up just as soon as Saul finished his act of disobedience? The odds are 100% because this is all under the supervision of God. God knows exactly what's going on. Saul should have waited, but he didn't. And as he's washing his hands from his act of disobedience, as he's cleaning up the mess that was left after the sacrifice, somebody looks and says, "Hey, look, here comes Samuel." Can you imagine what Saul's stomach and heart did in that particular moment? They probably traded places. Man, it would be terrible. You know that feeling that you had when you were little and you got caught? You were right in the moment of doing something that was ill-advised, to put it mildly, and your parents walked in and caught you. You were doing something dumb, and oh, Mom saw. And you have that moment of panic. I'm betting that's what happened with Saul. As he's standing there, as he's cleaning up, and here comes Samuel. Whatever Samuel had been doing, God kept him from arriving until this precise moment. And there's no coincidence about it. God brought Samuel at just this time. And Saul goes out to greet Samuel as if nothing had happened. And this isn't the last time this will happen between these two, where Saul will be caught in an act of disobedience and he'll act like nothing's going on. Get used to this. Verse 11, and Samuel said, "What hast thou done?" Listen to this. And Saul said, "Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash." Saul knows exactly what Samuel means by his question. What is Samuel asking when he says, "What have you done?" He's looking for honesty. He's looking for confession. You remember when Nathan said to David, "Thou art the man." You remember that? And David said, "You're right. I'm wrong." Well, is that what happens here? Samuel says, "What have you done?" And Saul says, "Well, the people were leaving, and you were late, and the Philistines are close." What's he doing? Lots of excuses. Lots of excuses. Verse 12, he goes on, "Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down upon me to Gilgal, and I've not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt sacrifice." He sounds a little bit like a teenager, doesn't he? Have you heard these type of excuses before? Well, what I really did, I did for spiritual reasons. Really? You disobeyed God for spiritual reasons, huh? That's exactly what he said. Look, it was the people were leaving. You weren't here. I did it for spiritual reasons, and then he says, and I forced myself. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt sacrifice. I didn't want to, Samuel, but if I figured that I needed to have everything right with God because the Philistines are coming, you know that, I know that, everybody knows that, I forced myself, I couldn't help it. Everything that we're seeing, he's got all of these rationalizations, all of these excuses, no good reasons.
So it was actually Samuel's fault.
Sounds a lot like that's what he's saying, isn't it? He says, you didn't come at the time appointed. That's exactly what he's saying. He's putting the blame on everybody else. You remember this happened in Genesis chapter 3? What happened? Well, Adam's standing there with apple juice or whatever it is dripping off of his chin, and he says, "The woman." And the woman says, "The snake." The snake didn't have anybody to look to. But we're just passing it all around. All the blame keeps shifting. And that's exactly what Saul is doing here. And as a result of his blunder, if we want to call it that, he suffered great loss. Look at verse 13. "And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly." He doesn't answer any of his excuses. He doesn't offer any reason. He doesn't say, well, the donkey had a flat tire. He doesn't give any of these reasons for why he was late. He doesn't address any of the excuses. He says, "You have done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever." We often associate Saul's greatest failure with his refusal to wipe out the Amalekites in chapter 15. And we'll get there, but it's a story you're familiar with. That's where we get the verse that the Lord would have obedience rather than sacrifice. That's where that comes from. That's where we get an awful lot about Saul and his opinions and his kind of the path that he took. But ultimately, his royal dynasty would end with him because of this act here in chapter 13. He lost the kingdom. Again, it's not a 3 strikes and you're out, because we don't have any strikes up to this point, do we? He's been humble, he's been deferential, he's been giving glory to God, he's been merciful, he's done all of these things, and now he does this one, and we would maybe in the back of our minds think of it as a seemingly insignificant act of disobedience, and he lost the kingdom. He lost the dynasty of Saul would not go on. Saul would be the last. In thinking about the sin of Israel in 1 Kings 4, you remember what they did in 1 Kings 4, in 1 Samuel 4? That's when they took the Ark of the Covenant into battle. They thought the Ark of the Covenant would be a good luck charm. So they were looking for a religious icon. And here in chapter 13, Saul is counting on a religious ritual. They took the Ark of the Covenant thinking, well, God won't let us lose if we have the Ark of the Covenant. And they lost. And here Saul thinks, well, if I do this, certainly God's not going to judge me for offering a sacrifice. He did. He did. Saul's kingly line would end with him. There would be no transferal of power to his son Jonathan, his firstborn. Now, maybe you're thinking in the back of your mind that we know prophetically that God said that the royal line would be the descendants of which tribe? Judah. Is Saul of the tribe of Judah? No, he's of the tribe of Benjamin. So why did God pick a Benjamite for the first king? And the only answer that I have for you is, we'll ask him someday when we're in his presence. We don't have it. Why would God pick a Benjamite, somebody who according to the prophecies given in Genesis and several other places, he's not going to have the line of kings come out of him? But he blew it.
He knew.
Absolutely. God knew what was going on. As we've said before, was Saul God's will for Israel? No, he gave it to them because they insisted on it. We want a king. But it wasn't God's perfect plan. God gave them a king. And they will deal with the consequences. Saul's reign obviously doesn't end tonight. It will go on. Verse 14. Samuel's still talking to Saul. By the way, the next king will come out of which tribe? Judah. David will be a king from Judah. Verse 14. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. The Lord hath commanded him to be a captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. How many strikes till he was out? Just one. It wasn't, well, you're getting awful close here. Nope. All of this good. We've watched his line, and it's just been straight up. He's been doing good, humble, deferential, merciful, giving the glory to God, all these things. And he steps out of line in one act of defiant disobedience and loses the kingdom. It just took one. Known only to God, though, there was a young man in the hills of Bethlehem. At this time, he'd have been alive. This young man in the hills of Bethlehem who's faithfully watching his father's sheep. He's writing psalms, many of which we still have. And he's developing his relationship with Jehovah in order to prepare him for his somewhat unlikely rise to power. He wasn't the oldest, he wasn't the biggest of the sons of Jesse, but we'll get there in time. But Saul has lost everything on one act of defiance. One act is all it took. They settle into battle preparations because the Philistines aren't going anywhere. Just because Saul messed up doesn't mean that the problem goes away. Verse 15, And Samuel arose and gat him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people that were present with him about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people that were present with him abode in Gibeah of Benjamin. But the Philistines encamped in Michmash. So Samuel makes the 10-mile trek, 10 miles or so, depending on the roads, from Gilgal to Gibeah. And then it would appear that a short time later, Saul and his army followed. Saul's army, he started with 3,000. He has how many now? 600. That's a reduction of 80%. That's rough. That's rough. He's gone from 3,000 to 600. Verse 17. So they're in Michmash. And the spoilers came out of the camp of the Philistines. I'm sorry, they're in Gibeah, not Michmash. The Philistines are in Michmash, they are in Gibeah. Verse 17, And the spoilers came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned unto the way that leadeth to Ophrah, unto the land of Saul. And another company turned the way to Beth-horon, and another company turned to the way of the border that looketh to the valley of Zeboim, towards the wilderness. So, the Philistines, with their massive army, they divide into 3 different raiding parties, and they begin to spiral out across the land of Israel. They're going and they're robbing and they're pillaging as they go. They're causing all sorts of problems. Remember, Saul had military victory. He'd only had the one fight, but he was where it was at. And now he's losing control awful fast, isn't he? As enemy raiders now are swarming across his frontier. They go in separate directions, attacking the children of Israel. But that wasn't all that the children of Israel had wrong. Take a look at verse 19. Now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel. Smith being someone who works with metal, iron, different types of metal. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. But all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man his share, and his coulter, and his axe, and his mattock. Yet they had a file for the mattocks, and the coulters, and the forks, and for the axes, and to sharpen the goads. So it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan, but with Saul and with Jonathan was there found. Not only are they woefully understaffed, they are also woefully underarmed. Somehow the Philistines had gotten in and had taken over the control of the means of production, so that the children of Israel were not able to produce weaponry. And the Philistines apparently also, according to verse 20, they also had the means to sharpen the farm implements so that they could be used as weapons. Now, the Israelites apparently had a file in verse 21 that they could sharpen things, but it would be a prohibitively long and involved process to arm your entire army with farming implements. But that's exactly what's going on. The only swords in the land of Israel were on whose belts? Saul and Jonathan. That's pretty rough. When you're going into battle and the only two guys with guns are the commanding officers and everybody else is charging with hoes and axes and rakes, it's not going to go well from a man's perspective. Verse 23, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the passage of Michmash. So Israel is lining up. They're in Gibeah of Saul or Gibeah of Benjamin, and they've got all of their sharpened farm implements. Their ox goads, and their mattocks, and their axes, and their coulters and forks. And the Philistines have gone out, they've been raiding. They're well fed, they're well armed, they're very well, they have all of the men that they could hope to have. They've had nothing but victory, and then they take the pass at Michmash. And that's where this chapter ends, with them lining up in a very, very uneven battle. We have the Philistines outnumbering the Israelites by a magnitude that we don't even know, because they are in number as the sands of the sea, and the children of Israel are just 600. So it's a pretty rough battle that we're getting ready to go into right outside of Michmash. We're done tracing Saul's rise. That's it. It didn't last long, did it? We haven't even been reading about Saul that long. Just a few chapters. He came in chapter 9, and he's lost the kingdom by chapter 13. It didn't take much, and it didn't take long. It's going to be, over the next chapters, it's going to be a slow descent into madness that will culminate with suicide in chapter 31. Saul will just run off the rails. It's about as good as it gets right now. It only gets worse from here. But we're going to start tracking not only Saul, we're also going to start tracking David, the young man after God's own heart, who's going to come in. They will meet, and their stories will become intertwined in lots of ways. But this evening, I want you to note that one act of impatient disobedience is all it took. One time. He got impatient. He was looking around. His people were leaving. He looked up on the hill, and he could see the Philistines gathering. He sees the camps of the Philistines. Their smoke is rising on the horizon, and he thinks, I've got to do something. And he did. And he lost the kingdom. I had a professor in college who said, a lot of impulsive mistakes are made by people who aren't willing to stay bored just a little bit longer. And that's true, isn't it? A lot of impulsive mistakes are made by people who aren't willing to stay bored just a little bit longer. Because when Saul was offering the forbidden sacrifice, he wasn't to offer it. How far away was Samuel? He was on the road. He was almost there, and Saul jumped the gun, got out in front, disobeyed, and lost the kingdom. It doesn't take much. It was no mistake that Samuel was late to Gilgal. God was revealing the character of Saul. Crisis doesn't make character, does it? But it reveals it. And Saul, in this moment of crisis, is revealed to be not the sterling man who we thought him to be this whole time. He was impatient, he was impulsive, he was disobedient, and rebellious against the words of God. He directly disobeyed what God had told him to do. So, as we've been tracking Saul's ascent, we've seen his great blunder, his step one in his it didn't take him long to get to the top. It takes him a long time to get to the bottom. His first step downward, impatient disobedience. Saul had all the excuses, but not one good reason to go against the Word of God. And the same is true for you and I. As we look around and we begin to grow frantic, and we think within ourselves and perhaps say to others, I've got to do something. Probably not. You probably don't have to do something. You should probably stop. You should probably, according to the Psalms, be still. Know that I'm God. We should not just do something so that we're doing something. Bad things happen when we do. We should wait. And if for us to obey God makes us look foolish in front of others, what should we do?
Look foolish.
We should look foolish. If our obedience to God makes folks walk away, as was the case with Saul, what should we do? Obey God. Why? Because do you think God could produce an army? Do you think God needs an army? No. God is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, we read in the New Testament. And He was able to then as well. When we feel like we have to do something, it's a good time to stop and don't. Yes, sir.
Well, I got several questions in my mind, but one of them, when Saul made this burnt offering, would that have been known outside of his encampment? Would the Philistines or the enemy have known that he had offered a burnt offering? Would it have meant anything if they did?
They may have known, but they wouldn't have cared. It wouldn't have been. I don't think it would have been a big deal. Because in many pagan religions, one of the last things that the leaders of an army will do before going into battle is make a sacrifice. So it wouldn't have been viewed as different, which is one reason perhaps why God wanted it to be different. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does. I was just wondering whether, because the Philistines, I don't think were a bunch of ignorant people, would they have known that he was going against God's will? Did anybody in the Philistine village or?
Probably not. Probably not. It would have, if they had spies who were there in chapter 10, verse 8, when Samuel told him what to do, but like I said, they likely wouldn't have known and wouldn't have cared. And so I don't think Saul wasn't making a step that was publicly, at least to his enemies, he wasn't making a public misstep.
Okay.
The children of Israel, would they have known that a king wasn't supposed to offer? Yeah. Actually, if you know Bible history, you know this isn't the first king to get in trouble, or this isn't the last king. He is the first king, but he isn't the last king to get in trouble for offering sacrifices. King Uzziah, you remember that name? King Uzziah was struck down with leprosy while he was in the act of walking into the temple to offer sacrifices. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Having your enemies making your necessities, like the Philistines were making the weapons for Israel, supposedly. Reminds me a lot of what's going on today. We got a lot of other countries that are actually our enemies making just about every one of the products that we use here in the United States.
Yeah, it didn't make sense then either.
No.
Yeah. When you let your enemies make your weapons, you should be highly suspicious of your weapons, for sure. Any other thoughts? Other questions? Next week we'll see what happens. They're going to go into battle. They're going to have more fights. Jonathan's going to go and he's going to fight. But if you read ahead, everything that Saul has done up to this point has kind of made sense. You look at him and you think, you know, I understand that he wasn't God's best for Israel, that he was what God allowed them to have because they insisted on it, but he's an okay guy. If you read next chapter, you'll see things and you'll think, why would any sane person make that order? Why would anybody make that decree? You're going to see Saul, he's going to depart from reason. Now that he has departed from the ways of God, he's going to depart from reason itself. And he's going to start making some entirely harebrained orders to his men. For instance, next week you'll see, don't eat before you go into battle. That doesn't work well. And we'll look at that next week, Lord willing. Any other thoughts or questions before we close in prayer? Then will you bow with me this evening? Our Father, as we look at this story, Lord, well known perhaps to some, Lord, perhaps not to others. Lord, it's sobering to think that it wasn't a long series of missteps. It was one brazen act of defiance. And Lord, even an act that seemed to be justified at the time because of the panic that was setting in. Lord, I pray that you would protect us from our own thought processes when we would attempt to do the same. When we're worried, when we're panicked, when we feel that we just have to do something, I pray that we would stop and look to heaven and allow you to lead us and guide us. Lord, I pray that we wouldn't fall guilty to the same things that Saul did. Lord, you say in your word that these things are written for our example. Lord, I pray that we would we would be able to learn from the experience of these men and women of the past. I pray that you'd be with each and every one as we go throughout this week. I pray that we would walk close to you. I pray that we would walk in obedience to your revealed word, to your will for our lives. And we'll praise you for what you do. In Jesus' name, amen. You're dismissed.